Before we begin tonight, just take a second. Maybe you're lying down already. Maybe you're still adjusting your pillow. Maybe you're somewhere far away from where I am. And it's either very late or very early. If you feel like it, you can let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always find that strangely comforting. Little glowing dots of people across the world, awake for different reasons. And if you end up enjoying this slow walk through history, you can like the video or subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure. We'll still be here either way. Now, dim the lights a little. Let's begin with something very small. Not a king, not a battle, not even a crown. Let's begin with a field. A quiet field in northern France. Damp, slightly uneven, mud clinging to boots that don't quite fit. A place where wheat once grew without argument. Fields are ordinary things. They exist for food, for sheep, for wine, for walking across when you are late. And yet, in the 14th century, fields began doing something else. They began becoming arguments, not because the soil changed, but because paperwork did. A duke owed loyalty to a king. But that duke was also a king somewhere else, and that king owed loyalty to another king. And suddenly, a field in Aquitaine was no longer just dirt. It was an administrative inconvenience. Homage was supposed to be a temporary gesture, a kneeling, a polite bow, a formal acknowledgement, just paperwork in human form. But temporary gestures have a habit of fossilizing. The King of England kneels to the King of France for land he technically rules, but legally rents. A king kneeling to a king. One crown slightly lower than the other. It must have felt awkward. Imagine ruling an island kingdom, commanding fleets, issuing laws, and then sailing across the channel to bend your knee like a tenant farmer. It was meant to keep peace. It did not. Instead, the act of kneeling slowly became a reminder, a scratch in the back of the mind, a detail that lingered longer than necessary. Temporary diplomacy has a way of fermenting. And fermenting is something Aquitaine understood very well. Wine was everywhere. Barrels stacked in Bordeaux, English merchants impatient at docks, ships creaking under the weight of something that began as grapes and ended as influence. The English loved French wine. The French tolerated English wool. Trade was practical, sensible, necessary, until someone decided to interrupt it. An embargo is always introduced as temporary, just until things calm down, just until negotiations settle, just until someone apologizes. Embargoes rarely leave. Smugglers multiplied. Fishermen suddenly knew unfamiliar coastlines. Wine barrels travelled at night. Clerks began writing things down more carefully, and that's when something quiet began forming. Not a battle, a habit. Taxes. At first, taxes were temporary. Of course they were. War is expensive. Armies must eat. Ships must sail. Archers must practice. It's only fair, they said. Just a little extra. Just for now. The English Parliament approved subsidies. reluctantly, carefully, always with the understanding that this was exceptional. Exceptional things are addictive. In France, the tale appeared. A direct tax on land, temporary, just until the war ends. The war did not end. Salt taxes followed. The gabelle, salt, that simple mineral that keeps meat from rotting, became political. Suddenly preserving food required a receipt. When something becomes taxable, it becomes permanent. Villagers grumbled. Nobles negotiated exemptions. Tax collectors grew ambitious. Corruption matured quietly. Temporary war funding slowly turned into the architecture of the modern state. And meanwhile, somewhere in England, a boy was practicing with a bow. Archery was practical, sensible, defensive. The law required Sunday practice, after church, before ale. It was meant to strengthen the realm, just in case, lasted a century. Village greens became training grounds. Shoulders thickened unevenly. Skeletons, centuries later, would show the evidence. One arm stronger than the other. Bones shaped by repetition. The longbow was never supposed to redefine warfare. It was simply an affordable solution. Wood and string instead of noble cavalry. But affordability has consequences. Knights in shining armor prefer heroic charges. They do not prefer mud, or arrows, or peasants with excellent aim. At Crécy, the mud was patient. The arrows were efficient. It must have felt absurd. Generations of chivalric poetry undone by weather and wood. Temporary defensive tactics became doctrine. And yet the knights continued charging. Honor is a difficult habit to break. Ransom culture developed naturally. You capture a noble. You negotiate. You exchange letters. You discuss price. War became, partially, financial. Common soldiers died quickly. Nobles were preserved for billing purposes. It was all very civilized, in a way. And then there were the free companies. When truces paused the fighting, soldiers did not dissolve. They still owned swords. They still needed income. So they improvised. Protection rackets emerged. Villages paid to not be burned. Castles negotiated contracts with former enemies. Banditry was framed as freelance security. Temporary unemployment solution. Permanent instability. The countryside adapted. Farmers hid grain underground. Livestock were driven into forests. When rumours of chevauché raids drifted through villages, smoke on the horizon became a language. Burning fields was meant to be strategic. Starve the enemy. Break morale. It mostly produced resentment and mud. Always mud. In cities, watch systems formed. Night patrols rotated. Curfews were introduced temporarily during emergencies. Emergencies lasted decades. Urban militias became institutions. Record-keeping improved. Names written carefully. Who lived where? Who owed what? Bureaucracy thrives in uncertainty. Passes were issued for travel. Spies quietly multiplied. Intelligence gathering began as rumor management, then became something else. Meanwhile, a girl in rural France began hearing voices. Joan of Arc was at first an interruption, an unlikely proposal. A peasant girl suggesting military strategy, temporary morale boost. permanent symbol. Her presence shifted something intangible. Legitimacy, belief, identity. The war, which had begun as a dispute over inheritance law, slowly fermented into something heavier. Nationality, though no one quite called it that yet. The Black Death drifted through all of this like an uninvited editor. Labour shortages changed bargaining power. Wages rose. Governments attempted controls. Temporary wage caps. Permanent tension. Peasant revolts flared. In France, the Jacquerie. In England, the Peasants' Revolt. Poll taxes had seemed reasonable on parchment, less reasonable in person. Kings negotiated, promised reforms, then quietly retracted them. Trust eroded gently. Artillery appeared next. Cannons were unreliable, loud, unpredictable, occasionally self-destructive. They were introduced cautiously, as experiments. But once you melt church bells into weapons, you rarely go back. Fortifications adjusted. Walls thickened. Angles shifted. Stone replaced wood. Architecture responded to anxiety. At Agincourt, once again, mud intervened. Mud seems to have had strong political opinions. French cavalry struggled. English archers stood firm behind sharpened stakes. Improvised wooden defences. Permanent tactical lesson. And still, the war did not feel continuous. It pulsed. It paused. It resumed. Generations were born into it without remembering how it began. A war that lasts long enough becomes background noise. Children practiced archery, not because of a specific battle, but because it had always been done. Taxes were paid not because of an emergency, but because they had always been paid. Temporary solutions had settled into the walls. In Normandy, allegiance shifted pragmatically. When English forces arrived, locals adjusted. When French forces returned, adjustments were reversed. Survival encourages flexibility. Wine merchants in Gascony preferred English rule. Stability matters when barrels are aging. Burgundy complicated everything by occasionally disagreeing with France itself. Civil war nested inside international war, layers upon layers, and through it all, paperwork multiplied. Letters of marque legalized piracy temporarily. Privateering became tradition. Naval raids along the Channel blurred commerce and combat. Fishermen became soldiers briefly. Then fishermen again. Then soldiers again. Identity stretched thin. At Castillon, artillery spoke decisively. Cannons that began as experiments now commanded respect. And yet even that felt less like an ending and more like an exhaustion, because by then the war had already accomplished something subtler. It had normalized the extraordinary. Standing armies, permanent taxation, bureaucratic states, national myths, all of them introduced gently, temporarily, just until stability returns. Stability rarely returns in the same form, and if you listen closely, beneath the clatter of armor and the rumble of early cannon, you can almost hear something quieter. The sound of habits forming. A king kneeling, a boy drawing a bow, a clerk inventing a tax category that will outlive him, a farmer burying grain for safety. Temporary, just for now, just until, and then a century passes. A king kneeling is a quiet sound. It isn't dramatic. There's no thunder, no clash of steel, just fabric shifting, leather bending. A brief pause in a crowded hall where everyone pretends not to stare. The ceremony of homage was never meant to be humiliating. It was meant to be orderly. Order is such an innocent word. The King of England would cross the Channel. Ships would dock with ceremony. Courtiers would arrange themselves with careful symmetry. The French court would prepare the hall, everything choreographed. Because this was not surrender. This was paperwork, performed with knees. A duke kneels to his king. A vassal acknowledges his lord. Simple, except this vassal also wore a crown. And crowns are not designed for kneeling. So adjustments were made, small ones. The English king would kneel, yes, but sometimes without removing certain symbols. Sometimes the wording of the oath would be softened. Sometimes the tone would shift just enough to preserve dignity. Temporary linguistic compromises, just until tensions settle. The French court insisted on clarity. Words mattered. Was the homage liege or merely simple? The difference sounds small. It was not small. Liege homage meant primary loyalty. Absolute, exclusive. Simple homage left room for ambiguity. Ambiguity is useful when you rule two realms. And so the ceremony became less about land and more about phrasing. Imagine scribes leaning over parchment, debating a preposition. One word could cost a war. At first, everyone behaved as if this was manageable. A technicality, a formality, just until succession stabilizes. But repetition changes meaning. Each time the English king knelt, the French court saw confirmation of hierarchy. Each time he rose, he returned to England, carrying something heavier than wine barrels. Resentment matures slowly. Like oak-aged Bordeaux, no one announced that this ritual was becoming dangerous. It simply lingered, courtiers whispered. Nobles watched posture carefully. Did he bow deeply enough? Did he hesitate? Tiny details acquire weight when pride is involved. And pride, like tax, rarely stays temporary. Some English chroniclers later described the ceremony with noticeable irritation, not outrage, just irritation, a tone that suggests something has been endured too many times. Temporary endurance becomes inherited grievance, and grievance is a patient thing. It waits. Meanwhile, the land in question, Aquitaine, continued producing wine as if nothing was wrong. Grapes do not care about homage formulas. Merchants did, because every time relations strained, trade hesitated. And hesitation costs money. So suddenly, the kneeling ceremony wasn't just symbolic. It affected shipping schedules. It influenced tariffs. It shaped alliances in Flanders, all from a bend of the knee. The ritual had been invented centuries earlier as a stabilizing mechanism. Feudalism was designed as a temporary solution to chaos after empires collapse. You distribute land. You exchange loyalty for protection. You create layers. Layers feel safe. Until someone sits at the top of two different pyramids. Now, the geometry strains. And so, the kneeling continued. Not because anyone liked it, but because stopping it would mean admitting the structure was broken. Institutions rarely admit fracture. They prefer repetition. Repetition creates the illusion of stability, even when everyone in the hall feels the tension. And perhaps that is the quietest beginning of a very long war. Not a charge, not an arrow, just a pause, a knee touching stone, and no one quite satisfied. The hall does not empty quickly after homage. People linger. They always do, not because there is more ceremony, but because ceremony leaves residue. The French courtiers cluster in quiet groups, pretending to discuss something else. The English envoys stand slightly apart, careful with their expressions. No one smiles too broadly. Too much warmth would feel dishonest. Too much stiffness would feel defiant. So everyone performs moderation. Moderation is exhausting, and exhaustion, over time, becomes policy, because here is the uncomfortable truth. Every kneeling requires preparation. Ships must be hired, guards must be paid, retinues must be dressed properly, gifts must be purchased, lodgings arranged, messengers dispatched weeks in advance. This is not just symbolism, it is logistics, and logistics cost money. At first, the treasury absorbs it. A royal visit here and there is manageable. But when relations grow tense, visits grow more frequent. Clarifications are demanded. Legal appeals multiply. Aquitaine becomes less a duchy and more a legal case. Lawyers appear. Records are demanded. Disputes over jurisdiction stretch into months. And lawyers, like soldiers, do not work for free. So funds are required. Temporary funds, just to handle this particular dispute, just to maintain dignity, just to ensure the king does not appear weak. Weakness is expensive. So in England, Parliament is summoned, not dramatically, just summoned. The king explains the situation carefully. The French crown has questioned certain rights in Gascony. There may be escalation. It would be prudent to prepare. Preparation requires subsidy. Not permanent, of course. Just for now, members of Parliament hesitate. They always hesitate. They want assurances. They want the understanding that this is exceptional. Exceptional becomes seasonal. Seasonal becomes habitual. And so, a tax is approved, mild at first. But once you prove that Parliament will fund military readiness in defense of overseas land, you create precedent. Precedent is a quiet architect. No one in that hall of homage likely imagined that a bend of the knee would ripple into institutional finance across the Channel. But it did, because if Aquitaine is threatened, it must be defended. And if it must be defended, troops must be raised. And if troops are raised, they must be trained. And if they are trained, they must be maintained even when not fighting. Temporary readiness becomes standing expectation. In France, something similar unfolds. Philip cannot appear weak either. If the English king resents kneeling, that resentment might translate into refusal. Refusal means rebellion. Rebellion means mobilization. Mobilization requires revenue. The tale begins modestly. A war tax. Understandable. France must secure its sovereignty. Understandable taxes are the most dangerous kind because they feel reasonable until they remain. Villagers who once paid occasional dues now encounter structured assessments. Clerks travel with ledgers. Names are written. Land is measured more precisely. Measurement itself becomes political. Once you measure a field for tax, you never quite stop measuring it. In this way, homage, the simple act of kneeling, creates paperwork that spreads outward like ink in water. More disputes require more records. More records require more officials. More officials require salaries, and salaries require taxation, all still framed as temporary, just until stability returns. But stability keeps being postponed, and meanwhile, in Aquitaine, the wine still flows. Merchants feel the tension before armies do. Insurance rates rise. Convoys travel with escorts. Tariffs fluctuate unpredictably. Smugglers quietly increase profits. Temporary trade disruption encourages permanent shadow economies. Fishermen learn new coastal routes at night. Dock workers become informants. Loyalty shifts subtly toward whoever keeps commerce smooth. Because, for ordinary people, sovereignty is abstract. But customs duties are immediate, and so we begin to see something curious. The kneeling ceremony was designed to prevent war. Instead, it finances it. Every repetition hardens identity. Every negotiation sharpens suspicion. Every tax institutionalizes preparation. The war has not formally begun. No grand declaration yet, but the machinery is warming, slowly, like a forge before the metal is placed inside. And perhaps that is how very long conflicts truly start. Not with rage, with administration, with irritation, with a word in an oath debated too long, with a tax introduced just this once, with ships hired for a ceremony that feels slightly unnecessary, and somewhere, quietly, a young English boy is practicing with a bow on a Sunday afternoon, because Parliament just funded readiness. He does not know about homage language. He only knows the law requires practice, temporary requirement, permanent skill, but we'll come back to him. For now, we are still in the hall, because something else is happening here. Something softer than taxation, something more fragile than pride. Legitimacy. Legitimacy is a delicate thing. It does not clang like armor. It does not burn like a field. It hovers. You cannot quite touch it, but you feel when it weakens. In that hall, beneath painted beams and embroidered banners, legitimacy was thicker than incense. The French king needed it. The English king needed it. Both had crowns. But crowns alone are decorative unless people agree to believe in them. And belief, inconveniently, is not inherited as cleanly as land. When the Capetian line thinned, when sons died without heirs, when succession became less obvious than comfortable, a space opened. A small space. Spaces invite interpretation. The French nobles, gathered carefully, chose a path that felt stable, a male line successor, a reinforcement of Salic law, a tidy solution. It was meant to prevent confusion. Temporary clarity, but clarity for one side can feel like exclusion to another. Edward III looked across the Channel and saw not just a throne, but an argument. His claim was not theatrical at first. It did not begin with banners and declarations. It began as positioning, as pressure. He did not wake one morning and shout, "I am King of France," he maneuvered, because open defiance would be reckless, but subtle defiance, that can be sustained. So he continued performing homage, while quietly asserting lineage. This contradiction is almost polite. Kneel one day. Imply superiority the next. Legitimacy stretched thin. And here is where things become almost absurd, because legitimacy depends on narrative, and narrative depends on repetition. The French court repeated, male line only. Salic law is ancient. This is tradition. The English court repeated, blood is blood. Descent through a daughter still carries right. Each repetition hardened the position. Temporary legal interpretation became ideological fortress. Scholars were summoned. Genealogies were examined with increasing intensity. Family trees became political weapons. Imagine parchment filled not with poetry, but with arrows and names. Circles and lines connecting cousins who had never met. One branch disqualified. Another emphasized. Lawyers, once again, employed generously. What had been an inheritance complication turned into identity. Because if Edward accepts exclusion quietly, he accepts subordination permanently. And if Philip acknowledges Edward's claim, he undermines his own crown. So neither fully yields. And here is where something subtle shifts. The dispute stops being about land. It becomes about recognition. Recognition is addictive. If you are not recognized as equal, you feel diminished. If you recognize a rival, you feel weakened. And so homage ceremonies grow colder, less theatrical, more precise. Words are weighed like gold. Did he hesitate before kneeling? Did he emphasize certain phrases? Did he avoid eye contact? Chroniclers begin recording tone. Tone becomes evidence. It's almost delicate, almost theatrical, yet beneath it, military readiness continues expanding, because once legitimacy is questioned, defense feels urgent. France must guard against invasion. England must guard against humiliation. Guarding requires men. Men require training. Training requires law. And so in England, archery laws intensify. Sunday practice is not optional. Village life adjusts quietly. Church bells ring. Sermons end. Boys gather with bows. Targets are set up on communal fields. At first, this is framed as prudence, just in case the French grow unreasonable. But as years pass, just in case becomes culture. Young men grow up assuming their bodies are part of national policy. Shoulders widen unevenly, hands harden. And in France, fortifications are inspected more frequently. Castles repair walls. Towns maintain watch rotations. Night curfews are tested during moments of tension. Temporary vigilance drills. Permanent urban habit. You see how legitimacy bleeds outward. A question about inheritance leads to stronger gates. Stronger gates require funds. Funds require taxation. Taxation requires enforcement. Enforcement requires authority. Authority demands legitimacy. The circle tightens. And still, officially, peace remains. It's remarkable how long a war can exist before it is declared, because war, in its early stage, is administrative. Petitions, complaints, embargoes, confiscations. Merchants suffer first. Trade is interrupted selectively. Ports close temporarily. Insurance grows expensive. Smugglers flourish. Temporary trade pressure becomes maritime culture. And as the channel grows tense, ships sail more cautiously. Convoys form. Captains begin carrying arms. Merchant vessels become half military by habit. No one announces naval doctrine. It emerges quietly, and legitimacy continues hovering. In France, Philip must appear decisive, strong, unquestioned. In England, Edward must appear patient, but not weak. Patience is delicate when pride is involved. And pride has a peculiar rhythm. It does not explode immediately. It accumulates. Every ceremony, every disputed word, every tax justification, every training session, all layering. Until one day, the idea of claiming the French crown no longer feels outrageous. It feels inevitable. And inevitability is often just repetition, wearing a mask. We are still before open war, but the air has changed. Legitimacy, once a subtle tension in a hall, now spreads across kingdoms. Children grow up hearing different stories about rightful kings. Clergy preach slightly altered loyalties. Songs begin reflecting grievance, and grievance, when sung often enough, sounds like destiny. But destiny is usually constructed piece by piece, paper by paper, oath by oath. And somewhere, in another hall, a clerk copies a genealogy carefully by candlelight. He believes he is preserving history. He is manufacturing conflict, not intentionally, just thoroughly. There is a moment in every long conflict when people begin to pretend it is not happening, not because it isn't real, but because it is inconvenient. Merchants in Bordeaux did not wake up thinking about dynastic legitimacy. They woke up thinking about barrels. Wine does not wait for legal clarity. Harvest comes when it comes. And for a long time, the English appetite for Gascon wine was a quiet bridge across tension. Ships crossed the channel loaded with something softer than steel. Trade is persuasive. Profit can calm pride until someone interrupts it. Confiscation is rarely dramatic. It is a letter, a seal, an order quietly delivered. Philip VI begins challenging English control in Aquitaine more aggressively. Appeals are accepted in French courts against English officials. jurisdiction becomes a weapon. At first, it is procedural, just a complaint, just a ruling, just a small adjustment of authority. But when you accept appeals from subjects who technically owe allegiance to the English king, you undermine him, slowly, deliberately, and Edward notices. He does not shout yet. He counters. Retaliation begins, not with swords, but with seizures. Merchants feel it immediately. Goods detained, ships delayed, tariffs adjusted unpredictably, temporary trade restriction, just until tensions resolve. But tensions do not resolve. They escalate through paperwork. Imagine a warehouse in a French port where English wool sits untouched because someone is debating legal rights. Wool does not understand diplomacy. It simply waits. Waiting costs money. So merchants begin hedging their loyalty. Flemish cities, dependent on English wool, grow restless. If France restricts access, Flanders suffers. If England retaliates, France suffers. Suddenly, towns become strategic. Not because of walls, because of fabric. Edward recognizes opportunity. Support Flanders. Encourage unrest. Economic leverage replaces open battle. Again, temporary strategy. Just until France negotiates. But once you weaponize trade, you teach future generations that commerce is a battlefield, and maritime life changes. Ships no longer cross purely as merchants. They travel in guarded convoys. Crews carry weapons as precaution. Sailors grow accustomed to scanning horizons, not just for storms, but for hostile sails. The Channel becomes tense water. Fishing boats hug coasts cautiously. Privateering licenses are issued. Letters of marque, officially temporary permissions to seize enemy ships, begin circulating. At first, it feels controlled. Sanctioned piracy. But sanctioned piracy has a habit of expanding beyond intention. Sailors who taste profit rarely return quietly to nets and hooks. Temporary maritime aggression becomes culture. Ports become louder, harder, and in the countryside of Aquitaine, peasants begin noticing something subtle. Legal appeals increase. Royal officials from Paris appear more frequently. Records are inspected. Authority feels less distant. For generations, English rule there had been stable enough, not beloved perhaps, but predictable. Now predictability fractures. Villagers do not debate Salic law. They notice who collects dues. And when that changes, loyalty becomes practical. If French courts offer protection or leverage, some local nobles test the waters. Allegiance becomes negotiable. Temporary flexibility, permanent suspicion. Edward's patience thins, because here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. If Aquitaine erodes legally, his claim weakens symbolically. If he does nothing, kneeling becomes submission. If he reacts aggressively, kneeling becomes absurd. So something must shift, not loudly, but decisively. And so he begins using a title more openly. King of France. At first, it is strategic rhetoric, a bargaining tool, a way to apply pressure, just until Philip concedes. But words, once spoken often enough, grow roots. English coins begin carrying altered symbolism. Heraldry adjusts. Claims solidify. What was once negotiation posture becomes identity. And identity is far harder to retract than a tariff. France responds. Confiscation of Aquitaine is declared, not as theatrical conquest, as legal enforcement. You see the pattern. Law precedes war. Documents precede swords. And now, finally, the machinery that has been warming quietly begins to move. Armies are not raised overnight, but orders are issued, retainers summoned, knights gather in halls that smell of oil and leather. Blacksmiths notice increased demand. Arrows are commissioned in bulk. Woodlands near English villages are cut carefully for longbow staves. Sunday practice feels less theoretical. Still, many believe it will resolve. A show of force, a reminder. Temporary mobilization. But mobilization alters psychology. When men gather with armor, they talk, they speculate. Rumors spread faster than official proclamations. France will invade England. England will land in Normandy. Flanders will revolt. Each rumor sharpens readiness. And readiness is intoxicating. It gives purpose. Young men who trained because the law required it now train because something might happen, something larger than Sunday obligation. In France, similar currents stir. Knights eager to defend royal honor. Nobles calculating ransom potential. Yes, ransom, because war, when it begins among nobility, still carries rules. Capture. Don't kill if the opponent is valuable. Temporary chivalric restraint, but that restraint will not apply equally. Common soldiers will discover that soon enough. For now, though, we are still in anticipation. No major battle yet, just seizures, embargoes, confiscations, titles asserted, armies assembling with cautious optimism, because almost everyone believes the same comforting lie, that this will be brief. A correction, a demonstration, a single campaign. Wars that last a century almost always begin with confidence. And confidence, like homage, can be repeated until it becomes dangerous. The channel grows restless. Ships sail heavier. Fields in northern France continue producing grain, unaware that they will soon become something else. Not farmland, not yet. But they are about to be introduced to horses, mud, and arrows. And the young archer we left earlier, he is no longer just practicing. He is being counted. When the English finally cross the Channel, it does not feel like the beginning of a century. It feels like a raid, a test, a demonstration of capability. Ships gather along the southern coast of England. Timber hulls creak under the weight of men who are half excited and half uncertain. Armor packed tightly. Barrels of provisions wedged into corners. Horses nervous in confined space. No one boards thinking, we are about to reshape Europe for 100 years. They think we are going to show strength. That distinction matters, because what happens next is not designed as permanent conquest. It is designed as pressure. The chevauchée begins almost casually. Mounted forces move quickly through French countryside. They burn crops. They seize livestock. They avoid heavily fortified cities. They do not attempt to hold territory. It is not invasion in the romantic sense. It is economic harassment. Temporary devastation. Just enough to force negotiation. Fields are set ablaze, not for territory, but for message. Smoke rises in thin columns first, then thicker, then horizon wide. Villagers watch from tree lines, from church towers, from behind stone walls that suddenly feel decorative. The logic is simple. Destroy resources, weaken morale, force the French king into battle on English terms. Efficient, cold, and meant to be brief. But something happens when burning becomes strategy. It becomes routine. Soldiers grow accustomed to torching barns. It no longer feels dramatic. It becomes procedural. You arrive, you loot, you burn, you move. At first, English troops may have seen it as harsh necessity. By the third village, it is muscle memory. And on the French side, something else shifts. When crops burn repeatedly, peasants stop planting as confidently. They hide grain earlier in the season. They dig pits in forests. They move livestock at rumours, not confirmations. Agriculture adapts to warfare. Temporary survival tactics become generational knowledge. Children grow up learning where to hide wheat sacks when riders appear on the horizon. This is how war embeds itself into daily life, not through glory, through habit. The French crown faces a dilemma. If Philip refuses to engage, the countryside suffers. Nobles grow restless. Questions arise about royal protection. If he engages too quickly, he risks battlefield disaster. Pressure builds because chevauchée is not subtle. It humiliates. Smoke is visible proof of weakness, and pride demands response. So eventually, response comes. Armies assemble, but assembling a medieval army is slow. Messengers ride for days. Feudal obligations are invoked. Nobles gather their retinues. Armour is inspected. Horses reshod. English forces, lighter and more flexible, move quickly. French forces, heavier and more numerous, move deliberately. Inefficiency begins shaping destiny. And then we arrive at a field. Crécy. It is not chosen for destiny. It is chosen for position. The English take defensive ground. Slight elevation. Muddy approaches. Archers placed carefully along flanks. They plant stakes. The stakes are simple. Sharpened wood hammered into earth at angles. Improvised defensive measure. Just in case. Cavalry charges. Just in case. The French army arrives in stages. Coordination falters. Communication blurs. Rain falls earlier in the day. The ground thickens. Mud again. Mud is impartial. Genoese crossbowmen are pushed forward. They struggle with wet strings. They are blamed for inefficiency. French knights, impatient, charge through their own lines. What follows is less heroic than chaotic. Horses struggle in mud. Arrows fall in disciplined waves. Armour that once symbolized invincibility becomes weight, and something irreversible happens. The longbow, originally a cheap defensive tool, proves devastating, not because it is noble, because it is efficient. French nobility suffers disproportionate casualties. Ransom culture falters under arrow storms. On that field, the idea of armoured dominance cracks. And here is the dangerous part. The English realize it works. When something works spectacularly, you repeat it. The chevauchée was supposed to force negotiation. Crécy proves it can also win battles. So the strategy expands. Temporary tactic becomes doctrine. Burn first. Force battle. Hold defensive ground. Let archers break momentum. It feels like mastery. But mastery breeds confidence. Confidence breeds overreach. In France, shock settles heavily. Nobility decimated. Questions whispered. How could mounted chivalry fall to peasants with bows? Blame circulates. Weather. Command errors. Crossbowmen. Rarely doctrine, because doctrine is harder to admit as flawed. Meanwhile, English morale swells. Young archers who once practiced on Sundays now see their skill reshape battlefields. Practice becomes pride, law becomes identity, and taxes feel justified because victory is persuasive. Parliament becomes more willing to fund campaigns that succeed. Success finances repetition. Repetition normalizes war. Crécy is not the end. It is validation. And validation is powerful fuel. Across France, fortifications begin adjusting more urgently. Defensive planning becomes serious. Cannon experimentation increases because if cavalry is vulnerable, something must replace it. Gunpowder. Once curiosity gains attention. Again, temporary experiment. Just to test. Just to adapt. And so the war evolves. Not dramatically, but mechanically. Each side learning. Each side adjusting. Each temporary solution stacking upon another. And the fields of northern France begin to look less like farmland and more like rehearsal spaces, because this will not be the last time mud and arrows meet. And the archer we left earlier, he now understands that Sunday practice was never just precaution, it was preparation. After Crécy, something subtle changes. Not immediately in banners or proclamations, but in confidence. Victory is intoxicating. It rearranges memory. It convinces people that what worked once will work again. So, when the English return to France again and again, it no longer feels experimental. It feels proven. And in 1356, near Poitiers, the pattern repeats. But this time, something almost unbelievable happens. The King of France is captured. John II, a crowned king, surrounded, isolated, overwhelmed. Capture, not death, because chivalry still operates at least among nobles. Ransom is not cruelty. It is business. The idea seems almost civilized. Spare a noble life, demand payment, restore balance. Temporary financial inconvenience in exchange for dignity preserved. But when the captured noble is the king, the arithmetic changes. How much is a king worth? Apparently, a kingdom. The ransom demanded is enormous. France must pay to retrieve its monarch. At first, it feels manageable. Painful, yes, but temporary. Raise funds, levy taxes, negotiate. But France is already strained from chevauchée devastation. Fields burned repeatedly do not produce surplus easily, so taxes increase. The tail once framed as emergency measure, intensifies. Collections grow harsher. Clerks arrive with stricter tone. Land is assessed more precisely. Villagers who once paid loosely now face structured obligation. Temporary war levy becomes fiscal system. And resentment begins to simmer, because paying ransom for a king who lost a battle feels unfair to those who lost barns. Meanwhile, John II sits in comfortable captivity in England, not dungeon misery, noble imprisonment, feasts, courtesy, negotiations. It is almost surreal, a king held politely while his kingdom strains. Ransom culture reveals its flaw. It assumes stability on both sides. When the demanded sum exceeds what the countryside can bear, instability spreads. Coinage becomes an issue. France experiments with currency adjustments, debasement, financial maneuvers. Money loses clarity. Markets grow uneasy. Merchants hesitate. Urban populations feel the squeeze differently than rural peasants. And then Paris becomes restless. The Estates General attempt reform. They want oversight. They want control over taxation. Temporary fiscal cooperation becomes political negotiation. Authority fragments. In the countryside, something more violent erupts. The jacquerie, peasants, long strained, explode in fury. Castles attacked, nobles targeted. Violence raw and unstructured. It is not organized revolution. It is eruption. Temporary uprising, but suppression is brutal. Nobility responds savagely. Order is restored. Yet fear lingers, because once peasants rise, even briefly, the social contract feels thinner. War, originally about crowns, now destabilizes class structure. And in England, something similar brews a generation later. Poll taxes introduced to fund ongoing campaigns. Flat taxes feel simple on parchment, equal contribution. But equal burden does not feel equal when wealth is unequal. The Peasants' Revolt in 1381 shocks the English elite. London sees unrest. For a moment, the social hierarchy trembles. Temporary concession, permanent anxiety. You see the pattern. Ransom was meant to civilize warfare. Instead, it bankrupts states and radicalizes populations. Taxes meant to fund victory now threaten internal stability. And yet, the war continues, because pride does not disappear with debt. In France, political instability deepens. Factions form, Armagnacs and Burgundians. Internal civil war overlays external conflict. Temporary alliances with England are considered by some French factions because survival outweighs national unity. Identity fractures, and England watches. Opportunity glimmers. When your enemy argues with itself, you lean in. Henry V emerges later into this atmosphere. Disciplined, focused, determined to exploit division. And once again, the crossing of the Channel feels calculated, not reckless. Agincourt approaches, and again, mud. It's almost repetitive, but repetition is the point. French nobility, eager to redeem earlier humiliations, assemble heavily armored forces. English troops, fewer, position defensively. Archers stake the ground once more. The tactic is no longer improvisation. It is tradition. tradition that began as temporary necessity. Mud slows cavalry again. Arrows fall again. French nobility suffers catastrophic loss again. Agincourt is not just victory. It is confirmation, and confirmation cements belief. In England, triumph solidifies narrative. In France, devastation deepens crisis. Yet even then, it still does not feel like 100-year war. It feels like phases, like chapters no one labeled in advance. Between battles, life continues. Fields replanted, markets reopened, children born who know only intermittent conflict. Fortifications improved incrementally. Artillery developed more seriously. Cannons grow larger, more reliable. Gunpowder, once curiosity, becomes investment. Walls thicken. Angles shift. Castles redesigned to resist bombardment. Temporary adaptation, permanent architectural evolution. And here is the quiet irony. The very tools that England used so effectively, mobility, archery, economic harassment, begin losing dominance as gunpowder matures. France invests, organizes artillery more systematically. By the time Castillon arrives in 1453, French cannons are decisive. The English, once masters of field positioning, now face entrenched artillery. Technology shifts balance again. But even that battle feels less like a climax and more like exhaustion. Because by then, generations have lived under this rhythm. Taxes normalized, standing forces institutionalized, bureaucracy matured, national identity hardened. What began as homage tension becomes state formation. And if you zoom out far enough, the war looks less like a continuous flame and more like a slow forging. Each temporary solution hammered into permanence, each improvisation institutionalized, each field that burned teaching farmers new habits, each tax that lingered teaching governments new authority. And the archer we began with, he ages. His son practices next, not because of Crécy, not because of Agincourt, but because practice is now law, and law no longer remembers its temporary origin. By the time cannons begin speaking with confidence, the war feels older than the men fighting it. There is something different about artillery. Arrows fall silently in comparison. They whisper before they strike. Cannons announce themselves. Smoke, thunder, a concussion in the chest. At first, gunpowder had been experimental, loud, unreliable, occasionally embarrassing. Cannons burst, metal cracked. Crews injured themselves more often than the enemy. Temporary curiosity. But France persisted, because after Agincourt, something had to change. Charging armoured knights into disciplined archers had become almost ritualized failure. Tradition was no longer reliable, so innovation received attention. Royal foundries expanded, metal casting improved. Artillery crews trained specifically for handling cannons. Not noble hobbyists. Specialists. Temporary battlefield tool. Permanent military branch. And here is where something subtle but important happens. When artillery becomes central, fortifications must respond. Castles that once symbolized aristocratic power, high walls, elegant towers, suddenly look fragile. Stone that resisted ladders does not resist cannonballs. So walls thicken, angles lower. Round towers replace square corners. Moats deepen. Architecture bends to physics. Temporary reinforcement projects become generational redesign. Villages nearby learn to expect construction noise as part of life. Taxes increase again, this time justified by fortification improvement. Protection is expensive, and protection, once provided by local lords, begins shifting toward centralized authority. Because cannons are expensive, maintaining artillery requires treasury coordination. Powder supply must be regulated. Metal must be secured. Crews must be salaried. You cannot casually raise artillery like feudal levies. You must fund it continuously. And so, France gradually develops something that looks very much like a standing army. Not constantly deployed, perhaps, but constantly maintained. Permanent readiness. The war that began with feudal obligations slowly produces centralized military bureaucracy. England, meanwhile, faces a different reality. Victories had been decisive, territories gained, treaties signed, but holding France proves harder than winning fields. Logistics strain. Supply lines stretch across the Channel. Local loyalties in Normandy and Gascony shift unpredictably. Some towns swear allegiance pragmatically, others resist quietly. Chevauché is effective at destruction, less effective at governance. Burning fields does not produce stable tax revenue, and war without revenue weakens persistence. Back in England, Parliament grows cautious. Funding campaigns across the Channel indefinitely feels heavier now because victory no longer looks clean. And then something happens in France that shifts morale in a way cannons alone could not. A girl appears, Joan, not introduced as legend, introduced as interruption. France had been fragmented, politically divided, militarily exhausted, financially strained. Morale matters in prolonged conflict, and morale had thinned. Joan's arrival feels improbable. Peasant background, divine voices, conviction, temporary inspiration, many assume, but inspiration is combustible. She travels, she speaks, she insists. Sieges that felt stagnant begin shifting. Orléans becomes symbolic. Victory there is less about military genius and more about renewed belief. Belief reorganizes energy, and energy reorganizes effort. French forces begin pressing more confidently. The English, accustomed to dominance in open field defense, encounter renewed resistance. Joan is captured, eventually, tried, executed. The immediate tactical effect seems minimal, but something lingers. Martyrdom cements narrative. Temporary religious fervor becomes national myth, and myth is durable. Over decades, the French monarchy consolidates power more effectively. Burgundian alliances shift. Internal civil fractures narrow. The war that once destabilized France begins forging it. Artillery becomes standardized. command structures improve. Revenue systems mature. By the time Castillon arrives, the pattern is clear. French cannons devastate English positions. The field is no longer dominated by archers and mud alone. Gunpowder defines tempo. And when Bordeaux falls, when Gascony slips from English control, something ends quietly, not ceremonially. There is no single dramatic declaration, just withdrawal, gradual, practical. England retains Calais for a time, but the dream of ruling France fades into memory and rhetoric. And yet, the structures remain. In France, permanent taxation, standing artillery, centralized monarchy, strengthened by necessity. In England, Parliament empowered by fiscal negotiation, military tradition anchored in archery law, political identity sharpened by overseas ambition and loss. The war does not vanish. It settles, like sediment. Generations who never saw Crécy inherit its consequences. Villagers who no longer hide grain still pay taxes designed during chevauchée years. Castles redesigned for cannon remain thick-walled long after artillery modernizes further. National identity hardens quietly, not declared, assumed. The idea that England and France are distinct political entities, competitive, rivalrous, solidifies. Before this century, loyalties had been layered. After it, boundaries feel firmer. The channel feels narrower and wider at the same time, closer geographically, more distant politically. And the most curious thing? The war never truly felt continuous to those inside it. It pulsed. Campaign seasons, truces, rebellions, treaties, renewed fighting. A century that felt like interruptions. Temporary measures repeated until they became era-defining. The kneeling ceremony we began with? It no longer matters by the end, because no English king kneels for Aquitaine anymore. Aquitaine is gone. The ritual that once symbolized tension disappears not with reform, but with loss. And yet the habits born from it remain. Tax systems, military bureaucracy, legal precision, diplomatic suspicion, all born from a ceremony meant to preserve order. There is something almost ironic in that. A gesture designed to prevent chaos instead incubates transformation. And if you sit with that long enough, you begin to see the 100 Years' War less as a single blaze and more as a slow reshaping of two kingdoms that could no longer pretend to be entangled. Not because someone planned it that way, but because temporary solutions, repeated long enough, become identity. Imagine being born in the middle of it, not at the beginning, not at the end, just somewhere inside. You are a farmer's son in northern France in 1420. Your father remembers English raids. Your grandfather remembers Poitiers. You remember only fortified towns and tax collectors. To you, this is normal. War is not a dramatic event. It is background policy. The watchtower at the edge of your village is simply part of the landscape. The thickened walls of the nearby castle look permanent. You assume they have always been that thick. You do not know that they were redesigned because cannons learned to speak. You grow up paying taxes that your great-grandfather was told were temporary. You hear sermons that gently reinforce loyalty to a king whose authority feels stronger now than it once did. The war that once fractured France has slowly centralized it, and centralization feels like inevitability to those born into it. Meanwhile, across the Channel, an English villager born in Kent grows up practicing archery because the law still says so. The urgency that created the law has faded, but the law remains. Tradition is often just expired emergency. Sunday practice continues. Young men shoot at targets more from habit than fear. But habit shapes culture. The longbow becomes identity, not because it is currently decisive, but because it was. Stories of Crécy and Agincourt are repeated by grandfathers in taverns. Victories remembered longer than defeats. Memory selects what flatters, and slowly narratives form. In England, the war becomes a story of glorious underdog triumphs, even though the final outcome was territorial loss. In France, it becomes a story of survival and eventual reclaiming of sovereignty. Both sides curate their century, and the most interesting thing, neither remembers it as administrative. No one writes songs about tax ledgers. No one sings about revised fortification angles. But those things endure longer than ballads. After Castillon, artillery does not disappear. It becomes core. Royal control over gunpowder becomes regulated. Production centralized. This changes power balance internally. A king who controls cannons does not rely as heavily on feudal lords with private armies. Authority concentrates. The war did not just shape borders. It reshaped who held force. And force defines governance. In France, monarchy grows stronger. In England, something slightly different happens. Repeated need for funding overseas campaigns strengthened Parliament's leverage. Kings had to ask. Asking creates precedent. Precedent matures into expectation. Expectation hardens into political structure. Temporary fiscal negotiation becomes constitutional habit. So while France centralizes around crown and artillery, England strengthens the dialogue between crown and representatives, two different institutional evolutions from the same prolonged conflict. And ordinary people, they adapt. Villages that once hid grain continue hiding surplus as instinct. Urban watches remain organized even when raids fade. Merchants maintain convoy habits. Insurance culture persists. Fortified towns become commercial hubs because security attracts trade. What began as defensive adaptation becomes economic advantage. There is something almost paradoxical here. Destruction accelerates innovation. Chevauchés burned crops, but it also forced agricultural resilience. Artillery shattered walls, but it improved engineering. Ransom culture strained treasuries, but it refined fiscal systems. Even rebellion jackery, peasants' revolt, forced elites to reconsider taxation structures. War exposed inefficiencies. Exposure demanded correction. Correction became institution. And yet, the human cost never becomes tidy. Villages erased from records. Generations who never knew stability. Nobility lines extinguished in muddy fields. Peasant anger suppressed brutally. Temporary devastation leaves permanent scars. By the late 15th century, when someone says, "the war," it sounds almost abstract. No one can quite remember when it began without consulting a chronicle. It feels like weather that lasted a lifetime. And here is something subtle and slightly ironic. The original grievance, the kneeling, the claim, the inheritance dispute, fades in emotional relevance. What remains are identities. England and France no longer entangled through overlapping feudal loyalties. The geometry that once strained one king kneeling to another no longer exists. The channel is boundary, not connective tissue. That change feels quiet, but it is profound. The 100 Years' War did not create nationalism overnight, but it made layered loyalties inconvenient. And when something becomes inconvenient long enough, it dissolves. The war teaches both kingdoms that ruling across the Channel is expensive, unstable, and politically corrosive. So they turn inward, consolidate, define themselves more clearly. And that inward turn shapes the centuries that follow. The Renaissance unfolds differently in each realm. Religious tensions later will fracture differently. State power grows on foundations laid during this long administrative conflict. And still, if you narrow the lens again, you see something simpler. A village rebuilt for the third time. A church bell recast from metal once meant for cannon. A tax collector who now carries standardized documents. A castle wall whose thickness no one questions anymore. Temporary responses turned unquestioned background. If you were alive then, you would not say, "I live in the aftermath of the 100 Years' War." You would say, "This is just how things are." And perhaps that is the most powerful outcome of all. When extraordinary conflict reshapes reality so thoroughly that it becomes ordinary, there is something quietly dramatic about rituals that disappear. No announcement, no trumpet, just absence. After the long struggle, after Castillon, after territories shift and negotiations harden into finality, something small vanishes from history. No English king sails to kneel in Paris anymore. No hall prepared with measured tension. No debate over liege or simple homage. No carefully managed posture. The ceremony that once symbolized fragile balance dissolves without ceremony, and its disappearance says more than its performance ever did. Because that kneeling was awkward, yes, humiliating, perhaps, but it also meant connection, entanglement, a shared structure, however strained. When it stops, the structure is not repaired, it is severed. And severing feels clean at first. Simpler, 2 crowns, 2 realms, no overlapping geometry. No king kneeling to another for land across water. But simplicity has consequences. The channel becomes not just water, it becomes border. Before, ships crossed for ceremony, trade, inheritance disputes. Now, crossing feels foreign, deliberate, more calculated. Something emotional hardens. And when identity hardens, stories sharpen. In England, the memory of victories grows brighter than the memory of loss. Agincourt becomes legend. Creasy becomes proof of cleverness over arrogance. The narrative settles into something flattering. In France, Joan becomes luminous. The reclaiming of territory becomes redemption. The long endurance becomes strength. Each side edits its century differently. And the absence of homage helps, because without shared ritual, there is no daily reminder of overlap. No visual symbol of mutual obligation, just separation. And separation simplifies identity. It is easier to say we when there is no confusing also. But what is fascinating is how quietly this shift settles into habit. Merchants adapt to new trade norms. Diplomats establish clearer boundaries. Military planning becomes inward-facing. The idea that England might one day rule large swaths of France begins sounding unrealistic rather than ambitious. Ambition adjusts to reality. Reality becomes expectation, and expectation becomes culture. Meanwhile, artillery remains. Cannons, once revolutionary, are now standard. France invests in permanent gunpowder production. Central authority strengthens. A king who commands artillery commands obedience differently than a king who negotiates feudal loyalty. The medieval order layered, flexible, overlapping titans. In England, Parliament retains fiscal influence earned through war funding. The Crown cannot entirely ignore the precedent of consultation. Temporary funding negotiations carved channels that later political currents will follow. The war that began with homage disputes ends by redefining how power flows internally. And ordinary life absorbs all of this almost invisibly. A farmer born after 1453 does not feel post-war relief in a dramatic sense. He feels stability, fields less frequently burned, taxes still present, fortified towns still looming, but fear slightly reduced, slightly. And even that reduction feels gradual, because trauma fades slowly. Villages once destroyed are rebuilt differently. Stone favoured over timber. Storage concealed more carefully. Trade routes recalibrated. Insurance culture persists. Merchants do not forget a century of unpredictability overnight. Neither do governments. Standing forces do not disband fully. Artillery is not melted down for ploughshares. Temporary readiness has become normal governance. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of it all. The war does not end in a single moment. It diffuses into structure, like dye in water. At first, concentrated, then spreading evenly, until you cannot distinguish where the event stops and the system begins. And if we drift back one final time to that hall, that kneeling, that tension, it almost feels smaller now. Not unimportant, just small compared to what it set in motion. A word debated too long, a pride slightly bruised, a tax introduced cautiously, a field burned strategically, a cannon tested experimentally, each one temporary, each one justified, each one repeated, until repetition hardened into era. And if you listen closely to history at night, it rarely sounds like clashing swords. It sounds like administrative decisions being made slightly too often. It sounds like habits forming. It sounds like a king deciding not to kneel anymore, and everyone slowly adjusting to that absence. Imagine a family ledger, not a royal chronicle, not a monk's illuminated manuscript, just a thick, slightly warped book kept in a wooden chest. It begins in the 1330s. A farmer writes that taxes increased this year. Nothing dramatic, just a note. Extra levy for the king's matter in France. He doesn't know this matter will outlive him. He writes about a good harvest. Then, a year later, about smoke seen on the horizon. Then, about rebuilding a barn. He dies, thinking this was a bad stretch of years. His son inherits the ledger. By the time the son writes, chevauchée raids are no longer shocking. He describes them almost practically. Riders came again. Grain hidden earlier this time. Lost 2 oxen. Notice that. Earlier this time. Improvement. Adaptation. War teaching routine. He adds a line about Sunday archery practice, if he happens to be English. Not complaining, just noting that the sheriff inspected attendance. Law tightening, normal. Then comes the grandson. He writes about higher taxes again, ransom for the French king, or funding for a new campaign, depending which side he lives on. He records coin shortages, notes that prices fluctuate unpredictably. He doesn't debate legitimacy. He debates survival. And somewhere in his lifetime, he hears about a great victory. Crécy, or Poitiers, or Agincourt. Maybe he feels pride. Maybe he feels nothing. Victory does not repair his roof. But it does justify next year's levy. He writes that down too. The ledger continues. A generation later, artillery is mentioned, not as marvel, as noise. New thunder weapons, tested near the town. Thunder weapons. Children frightened at first, then accustomed. By the time Joan appears, perhaps a daughter of the family writes of rumours. A girl says God speaks to her. Hope flickers. Then news of execution. Disappointment returns. But the ledger does not stop, because life does not stop. Fields replanted, walls reinforced, weddings recorded, births and deaths measured more consistently than treaties. And that is the quiet genius of a century-long conflict. It is not sustained by constant battle. It is sustained by continuity of ordinary life beneath it. If the war had been nothing but constant catastrophe, it would have collapsed into chaos. Instead, it pulsed. Campaign, pause, tax, rebuild, campaign again. Enough stability to continue, enough instability to change everything. And the family ledger closes around 1455 with a line that feels almost casual. Talk of peace, lasting longer now. No celebration, just observation. Peace is not fireworks. It is absence of smoke. And absence, like we said, can be dramatic. But here is something more interesting. The last entry does not say the 100 Years' War has ended, because no one called it that yet. To them, it was simply the King's War, or the French matter, or the Troubles. Only later would historians compress it into a clean label. 100 years, as if it were a single thing, but it was not. It was layered, messy, uneven, sometimes intense, sometimes dormant. And here is where the professional storyteller in me leans in just slightly, because the real retention of this story is not in the battles. It is in the transformation. If I tell you a battle, you remember arrows and mud. If I tell you a century of adjustment, you begin to notice patterns, a kneeling that disappears, a tax that remains, an experiment with cannon that becomes permanent arsenal, a law requiring archery that outlives its necessity, a kingdom that once tolerated overlapping loyalties, now preferring clean borders. The war did not just separate England and France, it simplified them. Simplification sounds peaceful. It rarely is. And perhaps the most fascinating irony is this. The conflict that began over who had the right to rule both realms ends by making it clear that ruling both is impossible. That realization is not shouted. It settles quietly, and if you were that final descendant closing the ledger, you would not feel like you lived through a legendary epoch. You would feel tired, stable, slightly poorer, slightly more governed, living in a world where canons exist, taxes are structured, and kings no longer kneel across water. You would not know that historians will someday call it transformative. You would simply know that things are different now, and different has become normal. He is standing on a village green in southern England. The grass is uneven. The target is a rough circle painted on straw. His fingers are already calloused, though he is barely old enough to shave. When the law first required archery practice, it felt slightly annoying. An interruption to market day, a structured Sunday after church. His father complied because the sheriff insisted. He complies because his father did. That is how traditions survive. Not through inspiration, through repetition. At first, he does not connect the bow in his hand to Aquitaine, to homage, to Salic law, to burned French fields. He only knows the string must be drawn to the ear. But one year, the call changes tone. Men are counted more carefully. Supplies are prepared more urgently. He is no longer practicing in theory. He is assembling. And then he crosses the channel. Not dramatically. Seasickness, cramped decks, horses nervous below. He lands in France and smells smoke before he sees battle. Chevauché is not glorious from his position. It is exhausting. Ride, burn, move, repeat. He sees villages scatter before they arrive. He notices that peasants begin hiding grain more cleverly each year. War is teaching both sides. At Crécy, he stands in mud. He plants his stake carefully. He draws and releases in rhythm, because training created rhythm. Arrows leave faster than thought. He does not see the French knights as symbols of arrogance. He sees moving targets. And when the battle ends, he survives. Survival feels like validation. The bow works. The king is pleased. Parliament funds more campaigns. He returns home briefly between seasons, tells stories in taverns. Stories become legend faster than accuracy allows. Young boys listen. They begin drawing imaginary bows before they are required to. Victory accelerates tradition. Years later, he returns to France again, this time older, less idealistic. He notices that French fortifications are thicker now. He hears rumors of cannons. He dismisses them at first. No machine can replace a disciplined archer. That confidence feels comfortable until Agincourt repeats the pattern and reinforces it. Mud, stakes, arrows, victory again. He grows older, believing the bow defines the age. But age does not remain static. As artillery improves, as French organization strengthens, as politics shift, his dominance fades slowly. He does not see the final loss of Aquitaine as personal failure. He sees it as exhaustion, because by the time Castillon ends English dominance in southwestern France, he is no longer fighting. His son is, and his son faces cannons. Cannon fire does not respect arrow range. The son returns home with stories not of glorious volleys, but of thunder. The village green remains. Archery law remains. But something has shifted. The bow is now heritage more than supremacy. Tradition more than future. And that is the quiet turn. The boy who began as temporary militia becomes symbol of a fading era. The war shaped him, but it also outgrew him. And in France, a parallel life unfolded. A boy who once hid in forests during chevauchée grows into a man who mans artillery walls. He remembers smoke from childhood. He now commands cannon fire. Temporary fear becomes institutional power. Both men age into a world more structured than the one they were born into. Taxes collected more efficiently. Authority centralized more firmly. Borders clearer. Rituals fewer. No English king kneels anymore. No French court debates homage wording. The conflict that trained their muscles trained their governments even more. And when they grow old, sitting near hearths, telling stories to grandchildren, they simplify it. We fought the French. We drove out the English. Clear sentences. Clean narratives. But beneath those sentences lies a century of adjustment. A century where temporary measures stacked like stones. And if you lean into the silence between their words, you realize something almost unsettling. Neither of them remembers a time before it. They remember early phases, but not before the tension, because by the time memory forms clearly in childhood, the war was already background. And when background becomes identity, separation feels natural. The channel is no longer shared artery. It is frontier. The boy who once practiced because a sheriff required, it now sees boys practicing because it is tradition. The reason faded. The habit stayed. And maybe that is the real story. Not arrows, not cannons, not kings kneeling, but habits surviving their causes. The 100 Years' War does not end with silence. It ends with normalization, with two kingdoms no longer pretending to be one tangled structure, with laws that outlived emergencies, with walls thickened beyond necessity, with taxes that never fully retreated, and with generations who inherited consequences without remembering the first argument. Imagine that hall again. The stone floor, polished by centuries of ceremony. The banners hanging heavy in filtered light. Courtiers arranged in careful geometry. Scribes ready with fresh parchment. Once, this room expected a particular sound. Fabric shifting. Boots stepping forward. A pause. A knee-touching stone. It was a controlled sound. Measured. Politely humiliating. The English king would bend. The French king would receive. And for a brief moment, the tangled architecture of medieval Europe would hold itself together through ritual. That sound, repeated enough times to feel permanent, until it stopped. Not with protest, not with reform, just with absence. No ship arrived bearing a crowned vassal. No oath required delicate phrasing. No court debated whether homage was liege or simple. The ceremony dissolved because the structure that required it dissolved. And here is the curious part. When something vanishes gradually, people adjust faster than they admit. The first time it did not happen, it felt unusual. The second time, practical. By the third, expected. And then it was simply history. The hall continued to host other ceremonies, coronations, marriages, treaties, but no kneeling English king. And that silence reshaped imagination. Because rituals do not just symbolize power, they rehearse it. Each performance reinforces hierarchy. Remove the rehearsal, and the hierarchy fades. Without homage, England and France no longer practiced being intertwined. They practiced being separate. And separation grows comfortable when rehearsed often enough. Diplomacy changed tone. Trade recalibrated. Military planning turned inward. The Channel, once crossed for overlapping obligations, now crossed for calculated diplomacy or war. The geometry simplified. And here is something that rarely makes it into heroic retellings. The disappearance of kneeling reduced ambiguity. Ambiguity is exhausting. For a century, overlapping claims required explanation. Now, the explanation was gone. 2 crowns, 2 sovereignties. Cleaner, harder, more distant. The war that began because of entanglement ended by eliminating it. And if you stand in that hall long enough, in imagination, you can almost hear the echo of that missing sound. Stone remembers pressure, even when knees no longer touch it. Outside the hall, life moves forward. Cannons remain in arsenals. Tax systems remain structured. Parliament remains assertive. The French monarchy remains centralized. Children born decades later never question why no English king kneels here. They do not know it once happened, because memory trims inconvenience. History later will compress the century into a title, but inside it, people simply adjusted. Adjusted to new tax norms. Adjusted to artillery. Adjusted to border clarity. Adjusted to the idea that the Channel was not connective tissue, but dividing line. And perhaps that is why the 100 Years' War feels so immense in retrospect. Not because it was constantly explosive, but because it quietly redrew the mental map of Europe. A kneeling once held 2 realms in awkward suspension. Its absence let them drift apart permanently. No announcement, no final trumpet, just habit replacing habit. And somewhere in England, on a quiet Sunday, a boy still draws a bow out of tradition. And somewhere in France, a fortress wall stands thicker than necessary, neither of them thinking about homage, neither of them aware that a century of temporary decisions shaped the world they now consider ordinary. And that may be the most enduring transformation of all. Not the battles, not the treaties, but the normalization of distance.